I want to welcome two of my favorite people here tonight to join us for this really important discussion about domestic violence, right? And the nuance that exists when we mix race, class, gender, religion, culture, all the things, right? It's not a black and white issue. And so I'm excited that you both are here and agreed to do this. You all are some of my favorite people. And so I want to introduce you, Carmen, Lewis, and Patricia. Introduce yourself, right? And tell the people why you are passionate about this issue or why this is something that you want to talk about. So I'll start with you.
Alrighty. My name is Carmen Lewis. I currently serve as the Executive Director for Central and Bryan neighborhoods, so shout out to Southside. But in my other life, I'm also a pastor. And so why I'm passionate about this topic, I have a deep, embedded need to see people live holistic lives. And during pastoring and doing my community work, the aftermath and the trauma that happens as a result decades later from domestic violence is really untrackable. And it is a soul tear, with what we would call a moral injury that happens to one's being in the process of being one that is subject to that type of behavior or those type of environments. So my individual call is a need to see people whole and complete. Anything that would take that away, I try to journey them or try to walk with folk to get to a holistic and a enjoyable life.
Right. Thank you. Ms. Patricia.
Hi, my name is Patricia Obede Hama. I'm from Nigeria. And when we talk about domestic violence, that's not something that we used to talk about when I was growing up. I have witnessed a lot of them while growing up, and coming here to this country in 1986, I learned new things. I learned that you can talk. I learned that you can be yourself even when you are abused in any way, no matter what. So I'm very passionate about this because I've seen it happen to many people that I love so dearly. I've experienced it myself. I'm really passionate about it, and I've been working for different nonprofit organizations that does this work.
Yeah. So today we're going to get into the conversation around not only domestic violence, but the silence that happens, whether it's a cultural silence or a religious silence. Of survivors of domestic violence are encouraged to stay silent. And so our first question that we're going to ask is, what are the pervasive, cultural or even religious messages about silence? So what are the messages that our people or the victims of domestic violence receiving that keeps them silent?
I think a lot of times we, as a spiritual background, can take what we would mark as failure personal. So when we see families that are staying together, when we see the father in the home and the mother in the home, when we see this unit, it almost gives a pledge of honor to that institution. And so the shame and the guilt and the blaming that is not so much in verbiage but in culture, it will keep one silent. And then it's also this whole notion of this false humility that Christ was like this undertone, low key, and so the humility of staying quiet, of staying silent. And it's also a misinterpretation of scripture. It's scripture that talks about how women are to remain silent. It's just a lot of different misogyny behaviors that is misinterpreted throughout the Holy Scripture. And so with that, my mom, who is a minister as well, I'm a fifth generational pastor, I remember coming home to black eyes. Now, she was not married to somebody who would say a street man. She was married to another minister. And so in her case, for her to say anything, number one, nobody told her and warned her, because this is a good man, this is a godly man. So we forget that godly does not mean not human. And so you have a human experience and a spiritual experience, and it's all wrapped into this human body, right? And so the divorce or the walking away is often seen as a black eye or a shame piece for that institution. And you're only really applauded in many cases in those settings for being productive or what it appears to be productive.
Like
You're
staying
not,
together.
right, staying together. You're not applauded, or there's lack of support for being human. So you have the victim, and then you also have the person that's the inflictor, right? And so both need
Sometimes
help.
in the same church.
Sometimes in the same time in the same pew, in the same pulpit. So with that, in order to embrace the humanity part of man and not have this mock like you're mine, you're doing good, and now you are a fruit of my labor. To be able to love on a level that understands the brokenness of man takes a deep looking not only inward but outward. That I'm going to be able to love you through your foolishness, victim, and I'm going to be able to love you through your foolishness, the predator. And the church oftentimes does not have both.
Yeah.
So the silence is not only prevalent there, but it's encouraged.
So Ms. Patricia, you're from Nigeria, so can you talk about the cultural messages that you received to stay silent? Or maybe it's even faith, because I know that you're a strong faith-filled woman.
Definitely. I'm glad you talked about shame in the church. And while growing up, I witnessed so many of them. There was a lady who got divorced because of domestic violence. And she was kicked out of a group in the church because she doesn't belong anymore. And also there were so many other individuals that I know that went through the same thing. And not only by the church, it's just they segregate them. You cannot sit, while I was growing, you cannot sit at a second place when you are divorced. You couldn't even move out of your spouse's home. Then you become labeled. And as you know, people who are abused, if they can, and when I use the word they can, because when people are being abused, it comes to a point where you feel it is normal. It is okay. And it comes to a point where you go, well, it's okay, it's going to be better tomorrow, and you just keep going. And so I've seen people who have been abused just stay there, and when they decide to leave, the whole community just despise them. And they put them to the side like they were nobody. It doesn't matter what your rank was before you got out of that relationship.
So that gets us to our second question. Really is about speaking to either scriptures or cultural practices that give either the strength to leave or the consequences of leaving. Are there any like cultural practices or scriptures that you can maybe point to that either give people the hope to leave or the strength to leave or the consequences, right?
When you talk about cultural, I don't think in Nigeria there's any culture that makes you want to leave. But nowadays, everywhere, all over the world, things have been modernized. So people's eyes have been opened to say, no, this is not good. And one of my previous employers had some guests from Nigeria, and I was amazed, I was surprised that they sent delegates from Nigeria to come over to the organization and learn about how we deal with domestic abuse victims. That was the best, that was the most happiest day of my life. So when they came and I asked them questions, I was like, no, you guys are not real. But I did the research and I found out that the government are now working in this. I mean, some men marry many wives. So when they abuse, they don't care. They go to the next woman or the next woman or the next woman. And the one that is being abused becomes the slave in the house. Because can't talk. Sometimes they deprive them of food. Sometimes they deprive them of different things. Because the abuser is the breadwinner of the house. And sometimes, not even sometimes, most of the time they don't have a bank account. So if they don't have a bank account, how can they leave?
Well, thinking of the scripture context that I will go to, the dying wishes of Christ was that you love your neighbor as yourself. And so I know everything else kind of get convoluted and it's not as profitable as a shade of profit, I guess, over truth. But anyways, that's the 9 wishes,
Mhm.
right? After everything else was said, after the walk on the water and everybody that subscribes to following Christ, the 9 wishes was to love your neighbor as yourself. When we look at this whole movement of self-love, and I'm not talking about the foolishness and the selfishness of that, but of what that can mean, but I'm talking about really the internal, what self-love look like. Self-love is really a radical act that empowers you not only to love yourself, but also to be one in communion. And communion meaning community, right? And so that scripture bears the approval, which a lot of people need, really is the approval and the affirmation and the confirmation that it's okay to choose me. How do I dig down? And I believe that we are triune people, right? We're spirit, we're soul, and then we're body. And I believe oftentimes when you have suffered such trauma, you have to dig to a place that surpasses what you're used to, trailblazing new neurological pathways. So it becomes like, a pulling from that shandos, my mama would call it, or a pulling from the ancestors to a place that is not literally, that you have not experienced, but yet it exists. That is the ultimate place of self-love that gives you a radicalness and an unapologetically way to live out loud in a true place of freedom that is deserving to be treated with kindness.
Right.
That's deserving to be treated with tenderness.
So like, how does community begin to undo the cultural silence? So you were talking about children. We could start. We could definitely start there. Are there other places where we need to start to undo the cultural silence?
I would say taking ownership, number one, of the power, or stewarding the power that you possess. In the Black culture especially, pastors and spirituality, whether it's subscribing to Islam, Christianity, Catholicism, whatever, we have a spiritual part and a spiritual connection that is just there. It's in us, right? And so with that, the spiritual connection does not rob the human experience again. So what churches, number one, can do is return back or either create a place of safety, and not just for cliche word purposes, but it has to be a safe place. And one of my pet peeves of humanity is how we get uncomfortable when one is bold and brave enough to announce its hurts and wounds. That makes folks uncomfortable. Because then it kind of jogs your hurt and wounds. For instance, when you were talking about being a victim of domestic violence, it has slipped my mind growing up seeing my mama with black eyes. But hearing that, it ignited something of, oh wow, I do remember that. And it's not because I didn't think it was, I always knew it was abnormal, but it's something that happens when you hear something that literally there's a connection that's made. And humanity has the power to heal itself. I think about our bodies, and that when there's a wound, literally the nerves and different cells run to the wound. I believe our soul and our minds are the same way. But if there's first not a place for me even to examine my wound, and I think the church has to become that place again. And the church not meaning the building, like the sanctuary, the sanctity of you being a human person and you being in a safe space. I'm being in a place I can examine that wound, and then I have the power to allow healing to come to that place. And I believe whatever is broken, we have the power to heal, and we have to be able to acknowledge that this has been a broken system that we have allowed to grow.
That's it. Yeah.
I always tell people, when you see something,
Say something.
When you feel something, say something. Don't wait until somebody talks to you. And that's why relationship that we fail to build, that's why it does a lot of harms. Especially during this COVID.
Yeah.
So many people have been abused, traumatized, killed, and I can keep on saying different words that have occurred during this COVID. It did not, we blame it on COVID, but it did not start during COVID.
Yes.
It's been there. We fail to notice it. We fail to see somebody. We look at people and we say, oh, she's quiet, he's quiet, not knowing that something is on. But when we build our relationship with somebody who is so quiet, we may learn a lot. So we need to do that. We need to continue to do that. We need to encourage people to do that. We need to listen attentively, listen to the silence words that are being spoken, that are not being spoken. You see how I said it? That are being spoken but not being spoken.
Right.
We need to listen to those. And when we listen to them, we need to acknowledge them. We need to acknowledge them, not directly, because as somebody who's been abused myself, you don't talk directly to that person about what is going on. You find a way. You go through the back door, like they say, to jump in and say something and validate. I'll give an example of what occurred when I used to have daycare. I used to have a daycare center, and a kid used to come to my daycare. Now a grown-up, handsome young man used to come to my daycare, and he would come with a little mark, a little something, and I would go, "What's wrong with Joshua?" Then one day I wasn't home. I wasn't at the daycare. One of my employees called me and said, "Joshua's mom came with red eye. She had glasses on, but we knew she had red eye. And what did we do? We need to be our neighbor's keeper." So I got up, got on the website, searched internet, and found an organization that could help without talking to Joshua's mom, without talking to anybody. I started making business cards. I started to find a creative way. Well, based on my secretarial background, I created a business card, some business cards, and I started putting them in the children's bag and lunch boxes.
That's good.
So from doing that, I don't know what happened, but the business card I did was based on this organization that I did not belong to. I had their phone number and the name. I started putting it. I saw changes in Joshua's mom. I saw changes in Joshua. Joshua started being happy. Joshua is 29 years old now. Did not know what I did, and doesn't know what I do right now. Just talking and praising him. So I give that example of those silence. When it's so quiet, when you start thinking what's going on. When we see sign, don't keep quiet. Start to do something without asking. And that's what we should do, to undo these type of things.
Yeah, that's a good story. One of my last questions is, and you all began to kind of talk about this, but what advice, because the YWCA has a large platform, and there will be many of people that will watch this segment, right, that may be going through this, or maybe they are like you, in helping and assisting Joshua's family, right? They need the resources to give to someone else. And so what kind of advice can you give to the survivors that are out there that are listening, that are afraid of the cultural ramifications or the religious ramifications of leaving marriages or relationships, or homes that are plagued with domestic violence and that have that are being silent, right? Because they feel like there's no other way. What advice can you give to people?
Do you want me to go first?
Yeah.
I think number one, to look at the silence from multiple communities, right? And also look at the silence from those that did survive. But the power of words, like words are so powerful, stories are powerful. An old church saying is, "Soul looks back and wonder how I got over." One way that we get over when I hear your story, the power of the story from generations down, from a historical context to when grandmama tells stories, those things, that is an ignitement and it's an encouragement to know, okay, if they got through it, I can too. And so when we hear those, it bears witness. It's a feeder to the soul without ever having to go into a structural religious place. Right there, my soul is getting fed and I'm hearing something. And I think oftentimes, even for those that have survived it, what does survival look like? Survival often looks like not only getting out of there, but it's the continuation that telling your story, it liberates you, the storyteller, but it also liberates the listener. And I believe that nothing happens by accident. So never think that your story is outdated, antiquated, that was years ago. You never know who is listening and who needs to hear that you got out. And I think that's something that we really have to be able to hold, the power of storytelling and the power of hearing, the power of triumph that just gets through, okay, I can do that, I can do it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you. I talk about building relationships, no matter what, no matter who, not with race only, but with other people, everybody, every gender. Building that relationship enable you to understand more about.
I am forever indebted to both of you for having this robust conversation. Like, I believe in the power of tongue. I believe in telling stories as our ancestors did to get them over. And so just by hearing your voice, I know that some lives will be changed and that somebody will hopefully get free from whatever their circumstance is. And so I want to thank you again for spending your evening with me.
Thank you.
I really appreciate it.
Yes,
So
thank you.
thank you
so much.
Thank you.